So let me start with a brief introduction. First of all, thanks go out to my own department, to Dr. Carpino's department, Comparative Cultural Studies, and to the Center for International Education, as well as to the College of Arts and Letters. They all helped sponsor the visit of Tanja Drückers. So I'm going to welcome our guest, who, as you know, is the Berlin author Tanja Drückers in English. What you will hear tonight is her reading in the original German, interspersed by English translations about every other paragraph. So you can prove the translation in your mind. You can concentrate on the German and see how much you pick up. If you're beginning students, you can blank out all of the English. If you're advanced students and listen only to the German, that is entirely up to you. When I first heard a graduate student at University of New Mexico's prestigious Deutsche Sommerschule give a lecture on Himmelskörper, Tanja Drückers' best-selling novel, my thought after the lecture was, oh my God, I have to read that, and oh my God, I have to meet that person. I never thought it would happen. So here I am, introducing her to you. The chapter you'll hear tonight is from that novel. I was struck back then by its stylistic nuance and by its literary register and by its historic content. It's multifaceted and multi-layered, and we're hoping one of these days it might come out in English. In the meantime, ramp up your German because it's worth reading in German. What you've seen on the posters tells about her background in American studies, Dutch studies, and German studies, and her professional career that spanned broadcasting, journalism, and freelancing. She's also developing a line of chocolates that will be named after each borough of Berlin, which those of you who are Berlin fans like I am know that is called a Bezirk, and each Bezirk will have its own chocolate, and it will be named after the Bezirk, and then have some culinary characteristics that remind you of that particular area. So I'm waiting for that as well. What we're hearing tonight has something to do with our overall theme of the semester in the College of Arts and Letters, and that is commemorating the end of World War II. And history is our theme tonight as well. What you will hear has to do with a true story, namely the sinking of the Gustloff. It was January 30th, 1945, and it was on its way bringing a load of over 9,000 people, women, children, military service people who were on their way out of Prussia because the Red Army was advancing and they were being evacuated. What happened was the ship, Germany was following a nautical maritime law, and because it had guns, it did not mark itself as a hospital ship. However, its guns were inoperable, so it was defenseless. It was hit by 4 torpedoes of the Soviet Navy and sank within 45 minutes. Most of the victims, the nearly 5,000 people that were killed, were children. The lifeboats didn't deploy properly. The lifeboats that were there were overfilled. It's considered the largest loss of life from the sinking of any single vessel ever. So this is what the backstory is. Please come in. The backstory is for this chapter that you'll hear. It's sadly pertinent to be reading about people that drown trying to escape a political situation or escape to a political situation that they favored, given the news that we're seeing from Europe these days. We didn't plan it that way, obviously, and it's something that is wrenching to consider in contrast to the events that we're commemorating now in the light of what's happening. So you're here to hear her, not to hear about her. So please help me welcome Tanja Drückers.
Thank you so much for coming tonight on such a rainy evening. And thanks to Marilya for these words. And also I want to thank you for the reference you made to the refugees who died in the last weeks before the European coastlines, which is really a terrible situation. Before I'm going to read in German, it's a bilingual reading, and I'm very happy that Marilya took the task and translated this chapter. Thank you very much for that. And before this, I would like to introduce to you the persons who will appear in this chapter so that you know a bit what's about. The novel Himmelskörper, the title would be Celestial Bodies in English, deals with a young woman, Freya, who is tracing back her family history. Especially, she's interested in the things her family did during the Third Reich and in the years after the end of the Second World War. And she has a twin brother, Paul, and they are very close. And at the beginning of the novel, they are small children, and then they grow older. And in this chapter I'm reading now, they're about 30. And Freya has an unusual job, or she's a meteorologist. I don't know how to pronounce that in English. She's writing her final thesis about a very rare cloud. It really exists. It's called Cirrus Pellucidus. You know cirrus clouds, very high. And Pellucidus is a cloud that it's not transparent, but almost transparent. A very rare cloud. She's searching for that, and the search for this cloud, which she will finally find, is always parallel with the search for this secret, this like dark secret she always anticipates. She and her brother, like from childhood on, she anticipates that there is something nobody talks about, some strange, dark thing. And in this chapter I'm reading to you, we will hear more about this. And then there is Renate, her mother, who was a child during the war. And Renate is sometimes also called Natilein. And then we have the grandparents. And their real names are, well, it's not autobiographical, but they're not, but their names here in the novel are Johanna and Max before the war, because Johanna, this is like a very German, a very delicate, nice name, and Johanna was a kind of sweet, a bit submissive woman when she was young, and Max was her quite self-confident and strong husband. And then the war changed their roles. Max was severely wounded and he lost a leg, and that's also a chapter in the novel while Freya and Paul are still small children, how they wonder about the lost leg, where it has gone. And now he's an invalid, and the roles of the grandparents changed, and she's now Joe and he's Maxian. And Maxian is a diminutive form for Max. So you see their roles change because he needs to be taken care of and all this. And so we have them. Then there's a short mention of Christian, very German sounding name. He is the boyfriend of Freya, and she is pregnant and is expecting a child from him. And then we have Dr. Tuben, who's the, do you say doctor father in English?
Dissertation director.
Dissertation director, okay, sorry for that. And also a meteorologist. Yes. And, well, something in general about my intentions. Writing Himmelskörper, Celestial Bodies. A lot has been written about in the last decade, not like many decades ago, but especially in the last decades, about German victims, like refugees, like fleeing on these big ships, and it's absolutely correct what Marilya said, that the sinking of the Gustav was the biggest maritime catastrophe. But I also thought, well, one has to have a more differentiated view on this and cannot just talk about the German victims, you know, like victims like the people sinking now, drowning now. I mean, it's known that especially in the outskirts of the Third Reich, like this area, West Prussia, that many people were really very fascinated by Hitler, and these were not people who were like fighting in the resistance, you know. I mean, I'm not saying that they deserve drown, but you have to have like at least an ambivalent view on this, which people were on these boats. So I wrote my novel also like taking a closer view and writing about a special family secret that haunts this family here in my novel. We will hear a bit more about this.
Mach dir die Bremse ganz schnell an, ja? Das ist nicht nur der Ball.
Ah, okay, super.
Und? Besser, ne?
Yes.
Ja.
And now I'm changing into German. And well, as you have heard, I have a very strong German accent. Even though I have gone for a whole year, as when I was 16, to a school in America, I still have a strong German accent. I can't help it. So now I'm changing into German. Das leuchtende Schiff. Dieses Wochenende kümmerte ich mich wieder um Joe. Paul war vor 14 Tagen hier gewesen. Meine Mutter war aus der vollgerumpelten, unübersichtlichen Wohnung unserer Großeltern in der Mindener Grevestraße nicht mehr wegzudenken. Bring mir den Fotoband, Freier, rief Joe und zog sich die Moherdecke bis fast an die Schultern hoch. Sie saß auf dem Sofa, ihrem Lieblingsplatz im Wohnzimmer. Mit einer fahrigen Handbewegung nahm ich die Ostseebäder von einem der unzähligen kleinen Beistelltischchen und legte Joe das Buch auf den Schoß. Ich war ein wenig abgelenkt heute, denn ich hatte gestern Abend einen langen Abend mit Dr. Tuben und Christian verbracht. Die beiden verstanden sich gut, nachdem sie sich vor einem Jahr kennengelernt hatten. An dem Abend, an dem auch ich Christian zum ersten Mal traf. Dr. Tuben hatte auf einer öffentlichen Veranstaltung ein Buch vorgestellt, dessen Mitherausgeber er war. The Light Book war bei einem obskuren Verlag in Los Angeles erschienen. Es ging um den Zusammenhang von Licht und Gesundheit, um die vielfältigen Auswirkungen von natürlichem und künstlichem Licht auf den Menschen. Tuben hatte in den vergangenen Jahren einige ausgedehnte Reisen in die Arktis unternommen, um unter anderem einen Gemütszustand zu erforschen, den die Eskimos Nordkanadas, genauer gesagt der Ellesmere Islands, als Piblokto bezeichnen. Dabei rennt der Betroffene hinaus aufs Eis, schreit, gestikuliert und reißt sich trotz der Minustemperaturen die Kleider vom Leib. Der hysterische Anfall endet damit, dass der Kranke vor Kälte und Erschöpfung zusammenbricht. Aber Piblokto ist nur eines unter vielen winter- und lichtmangelbedingten Krankheitsbildern, für die Eskimos zahlreiche Namen parat halten. Entschuldigung. Tuben interessierte sich brennend für sie.
The lighted ship. This weekend, I was once again in charge of Joe. Paul had been here 14 days ago, and there was simply no way to extract my mother from the cluttered, disorganized apartment of my grandmother's on Minden's Grevestraße. Bring me the coffee table book, Freya, called Joe, pulling the mohair blanket almost to her shoulders. She sat on the sofa, her favorite spot in the apartment. Absent-mindedly, I took the Resorts of the Baltic from one of the countless small side tables and laid the book in Joe's lap. I was a bit distracted today because I had spent a long evening with Dr. Tuben and Christian the night before. The two of them were fast friends after having met a year ago on the very evening that I had met Christian for the first time myself. Dr. Tuben had given a public talk on a book he had co-edited, The Light Book. It had appeared with an obscure publisher in Los Angeles. It was about the relation between light and health, about the manifold effects of natural and artificial lighting on humans. Tuben had undertaken several extensive trips to Antarctica in recent years in order, among other things, to conduct research on a state of mind that the Eskimos of northern Canada, or more specifically of the Ellesmere Islands, called Piblokto. In this state, the affected person runs out onto the ice, screaming and gesticulating, then tears off every stitch of clothing despite extremely low temperatures. The attack of hysteria ends with the afflicted person collapsing from cold and exhaustion. But Piblokto is only one of many manifestations of illnesses conditioned by lack of light, for which Eskimos are ready with any number of names. Tuben was passionately interested in it all.
Als wir nachher mit ein paar anderen in einer Kneipe saßen, begann Dr. Tuben ein wenig zu sticheln, dass ich mir mit der Erstellung des neuen Wolkenatlas eine reichlich preußische Aufgabe gestellt hätte. Doch ich hatte ihm gestanden, dass ich in letzter Zeit nichts getan hatte, gar nichts, außer einen Hauch von Wolke zu suchen, so lichtdurchlässig, dass die Bezeichnung Wolke schon fast irreführend sei. Unendlich langsam blätterte Joe jetzt Seite um Seite des Ostseebänder Bildbandes machte schmatzende und glucksende Geräusche, die ich gelernt hatte, als Wohlbefinden
und ein gewisses Ruhebedürfnis zu deuten. Maxchen hatte für die letzten Wochen seines Lebens in ihre Wohnung zurückkehren können, aber Joe und er hatten nicht mehr viel miteinander gesprochen. Jeder lag krank in seinem Zimmer und sie wurden eifersüchtig aufeinander, wenn Renate, Paul oder ich scheinbar länger in einem Zimmer weilten als im anderen. Nun hatte Joe schon wieder vergessen, dass Maxchen tot war. Das Buch kannst du Maxchen auch ruhig mal mitbringen. Der kann dir zu jedem Bild was erzählen, dann ist es für dich nicht so langweilig bei ihm im Krankenhaus, murmelte Joe. Ich war erstaunt, wie klar sie manchmal noch denken und sprechen konnte. Boshaftigkeit beflügelte ihren Geist, das war mir schon aufgefallen. Ich nahm Joe das Buch aus der Hand und reichte ihr eine Schale Kompott. Sie warf einen skeptischen Blick auf die Schale, dann goss sie sich mehrere lange Bahnen Rosenhonig auf das Kompott. Hatte sie in früheren Stadien ihrer Krankheit nur großzügig ihren Löffel vollgeladen, so leerte sie jetzt einfach das halbe Glas aus. Vielleicht würde sie ja auf diese Weise wenigstens einen winzigen Bruchteil ihrer gehorteten Schätze noch zu Lebzeiten genießen.
While sitting with a few other people afterward in a pub, Dr. Tubin began to needle me a bit about my having set myself what he called quite the prescient task of cataloging a new compendium of clouds. However, I confessed to him that recently I had not done anything, simply nothing, except attempting to locate a wisp so transparent that the term cloud seemed to be almost misleading. Infinitely slowly, Joe turned every page of the book on Baltic bathing sites, made smacking and gulping sounds that I had learned connoted well-being and a certain need for quiet. Maxchen had been able to return to her apartment for the final weeks of his life, but he and Joe had not spoken much with each other. Each of them had lain in his or her sick room, and they became jealous of one another whenever Renate, Paul, or I gave the appearance of lingering longer in one room than the other. Now Joe had already forgotten once again that dear Maxchen was dead. Feel free to go and bring Maxchen this book. He can tell you something about every picture. Then, being in the hospital with him won't be so boring for you, Joe murmured. I was astonished at how clearly she was still able to think and speak. Rancor gave her spirit wings. That much had already become apparent to me. I took the book from Joe's grasp and handed her a bowl of stewed fruit. She glanced skeptically at the bowl, then drizzled several long streams of rose honey onto the fruit. Though early in her illness she would have merely generously loaded up her spoon, now she just poured out half the jar. Perhaps in this fashion she might yet manage to use up at least a tiny fraction of her hoarded treasures while she was still alive.
Nach jener Präsentation von The Lightbook war ein junger Mann aus dem Publikum mit in die Kneipe gekommen. Er hatte sich als Christian vorgestellt und mir erzählt, dass er Tischler sei. Wir hatten daraufhin ein langes, ebenso verqueres wie amüsantes Gespräch über den Einfluss des Wetters auf die Holzbeschaffenheit geführt und mit Tuben bis morgen zusammengesessen, als hätten wir drei schon oft gemeinsam die Nächte durchzecht. Als wir endlich unter einem wolkenlosen Morgenhimmel aufbrachen, hatte Christian mich nach meiner Telefonnummer gefragt und meine Hand kurz in seine genommen. Jetzt stand Renate in der Tür. Freya, hilfst du mir kurz, Joes fürchterlich schwere Truhe im Schlafzimmer umzustellen, damit der Rollstuhl Platz hat? Nachdem ich meiner Mutter geholfen hatte, setzte ich mich wieder auf den Hocker neben Joe. Sie hatte ihre Augen halb geschlossen, nur durch einen Schlitz schien sie mich anzusehen. Sie sah so fremd aus, war mir so fremd geworden in den letzten Jahren. Doch dann seufzte sie auf, wie sie schon immer aufgeseufzt hatte, auch als ich als Kind auf ihrem Schoß herumgeturnt hatte, und lächelte mich kopfschüttelnd an. Werd bloß nicht so alt wie ich. Joe, ich nutzte den guten Moment. Was war für dich die schönste Zeit deines Lebens? Die schönste? Kind, das weiß ich nicht mehr. Ist das Leben schön? Ich weiß ja gar nichts mehr. Was war besonders furchtbar? Jemand anderes hätte vielleicht den Tod des Ehepartners, zumal er erst sehr kurz zurücklag, erwähnt. Aber Joe wiegte den Kopf. Wie wir unser Haus verlassen mussten, alles, was wir hatten, da lassen mussten, fast alles. Mein Klavier, die Biedermeier-Kommode, die Vorhänge mit dem Lilienmuster, die habe ich so geliebt. Und den Eichenschrank aus der Familie meines Vaters und die Kasse aus dem Marzipangeschäft in Königsberg, die ist mit der 3. Seekiste untergegangen. Die liegt immer noch in der Ostsee, bei den Polen irgendwo. Ja, das war das Schlimmste. Und Joe, wie war das, als ihr geflohen seid? Ich meine, ihr musstet doch auf dieses Schiff, die Theodor. Wie kamt ihr darauf?
After that talk on the light book, a young man had accompanied us to the pub. He had introduced himself to me as Christian and told me he was a carpenter. We had then conducted a long conversation, as quirky as it was amusing, about the influence of weather on the characteristics of wood, and had sat there with Tuben until morning came, as if we three had often spent whole nights drinking together. When we finally parted ways beneath the cloudless morning sky, Christian had asked me for my telephone number and had briefly held my hand in his own. Now Renate stood in my doorway. Freya, can you just lend me a hand getting Joe's terribly heavy trunk into the bedroom so there's room for the wheelchair? After I'd helped my mother, I sat back down on the footstool next to Joe. She had half closed her eyes so that she seemed to be peering at me through just a slit. She looked so strange, had become a stranger to me in the past years, but then she took a sigh-like breath, the way she always had when I had bounced around on her lap as a child, and then smiled at me with a shake of her head. Just see to it you don't get as old as I am. Joe, I wanted to capitalize on her mood. What was it for you? What was for you the nicest time of your life? The nicest, dear child, I don't know anymore. Is life nice? I don't know a thing anymore. And what was really awful? Someone else might have mentioned the death of a spouse, since it had been only very recent. But Jo tilted her head from side to side. When we had to leave our house, everything we had to be left behind. Almost everything, my piano, the antique dresser, the curtains with the lily pattern. I loved them so much. And the oak armoire from my father's family, and the cash register from the marzipan shop in Königsberg that went down with the third sea chest. It's still down there in the Baltic, somewhere near Poland. Yes, that was the worst. And Joe, how was it when you had to leave? I mean, you had to get onto that ship, the Theodore. How'd you do it?
At this point, I just want to explain shortly that, as you noticed, this family tries to flee with another boat, with a Theodore, and this was a mine search boat. Do you say Minensuchboot? Yes. In diesem Moment stand meine Mutter wieder in der Tür und unterbrach uns, was sonst nicht ihre Art war. Es gibt ja so verrückte Geschichten über den Untergang der Gustloff. Das Bernsteinzimmer soll vielleicht auf dem Schiff gewesen sein. Polnische Suchteams haben nichts aus dem Wrack bergen können. Aber wer weiß, vielleicht sind ja schon andere damit vorher verschwunden. Ganz wie früher fiel Joe ihr ins Wort. Ja, alles was nicht nied- und nagelfest ist, nehmen die mit. Nie an polnischen Tankstellen tacken. Dann fehlen nachher die Radkappen. Meine Mutter holte einmal tief Luft, schwieg aber. Seitdem meine Großmutter dement war, hatte sie absolute Narrenfreiheit. Was sie auch sagte, nahm niemand mehr ernst. Renate schluckte also ihren Ärger herunter und begann von Neuem. Das Bernsteinzimmer, das ja eine Weile lang im Königsberger Schloss. In diesem Moment klingelte das Telefon und meine Mutter hastete in den Flur. An ihrer Stimme hörte ich, dass Peter anrief. Peter ist the father of Paul and Freya and husband of Renate. Ich schloss die Tür. Joe schien zu schlafen. Ich nahm mir fest vor, mich in den nächsten Tagen wieder an meinen Wolkenatlas zu setzen und die digitalen Bilder, die man mir aus dem Ausland zugeschickt hatte, zu klassifizieren. Ein Altocumulus kurz vor einem Monsun in Kaschmir, ein Cirrus bissatus, also ein grobflockig dichter Cirrus aus Umeå, Schweden. Ein Cumulus congestus, hoch aufgetürmt, ein Kobold mit Hut aus Seattle und Cumulimbus mamba mit beutelförmigen Auswüchsen aus Tabriz im Iran. Aber auf mich warteten noch hunderte Bilder, die ich zudem in Unterklassen aufteilen musste. Nun warf ich wieder einen Blick hin zu Joe. Wie ein Reptil, schläfrig, träge, mit halb geschlossenen Augen, lag meine Großmutter auf dem Sofa. Völlig unberechenbar. In einem Moment weinerlich und hilflos, im nächsten boshaft und gewitzt. Ob sie wohl noch in der Lage sein würde, meine Frage zu beantworten?
At this moment, my mother appeared in the door and interrupted us, which she didn't usually do. There were such crazy stories about the sinking of the Gustloff. The amber room was supposed to have been on the ship. Polish search teams couldn't retrieve anything from the wreckage, but who knows? Maybe others took off with it, even before that. Just like she used to do, Joe cut her off. Yeah, everything that isn't bolted down, they take. Don't ever get gas at Polish gas stations, because then you'll find your hubcaps gone. My mother took a deep breath, but remained silent. Since my grandmother had gotten dementia, she had carte blanche. No matter what she said, no one took her seriously anymore. Renate gulped back her irritation and started over. The Amber Room, which for a while was in the Königsberg Palace. At this moment the phone rang and my mother hastened into the hallway. I could tell by her voice it was Peter calling. I closed the door. Joe seemed to be sleeping. I made up my mind to sit back down to my compendium of clouds in the next few days and to classify the digital photos I'd been sent from abroad. An altocumulus just before a monsoon in Kashmir, a cirrus spistatus, that is to say, a coarse-flaked dense cirrus from Umeå, Sweden, a cumulus congestus towering high, a goblin with a hat from Seattle, and a cumulonimbus mama with bag-like growths from Tabriz in Iran. But hundreds of photos awaited my apportioning into subclasses. Now I cast another glance at Joe. Like a reptile, sleepy, lethargic, with half-closed eyes, my grandmother lay on the sofa, completely unpredictable, one moment whiny and helpless, the next nasty and witty. I wondered if she would ever again be in a position to answer my questions.
Joe, wie war das nochmal? Ihr wart am Pier und wolltet auf die Theodor. Die war aber schon belegt, weil ihr so spät ankamt mit eurem ganzen Gepäck. Aber irgendwie wurdet ihr am nächsten Tag doch noch außer der Reihe an Bord genommen. Meine Großmutter gähnte und antwortete, als hätte ich sie gerade nach einem Kuchenrezept gefragt. Am Anfang wurde gefragt, wer in der Partei war. Nachher wurde das zu umständlich und man ging einfach davon aus, dass alle in der Partei waren. Wir warteten schon bei minus 20 Grad seit, ich glaube, 1,5 Tagen. Meine Füße habe ich nicht mehr gespürt. Irgendwann kam so ein Schiffsmensch, keine Ahnung, wie man den nennt, Maxchen wüsste das, und er sagte, noch 8 Leute. 8 und nicht mehr. Plötzlich drängelten sich da 6 junge Frauen nach vorn. Genau, so war das. Woher die so schnell kamen, weiß ich nicht. Flink waren die. Aber mir platzte der Kragen. Wir warteten hier seit 1,5 Tagen. Und dann drängeln da so junge Dinger, die auch noch richtig schicke Wintermäntel anhatten, gar nicht verfroren aussahen. Ich rief, wir warten länger, wir sind endlich einmal dran. Der Schiffsmensch winkte mir und Lena zu. Ja, genau so war das. Ich kann mich gut erinnern. Schrecklich war das. Ich nahm Renate Huckepack, denn ich wollte, dass wir als ein Mensch durchgingen. Aber plötzlich stand neben uns noch eine andere Dame. Ich kannte sie, Frau Hundstein, mit ihrem Sohn Rudolf, den alle Rudi nannten. Was hat die nochmal gemacht, die Frau Hundstein? Friseuse war die, jetzt habe ich es wieder. Ihr Mann irgendwo an der Ostfront. Der Rudi hatte knallrote Haare und war exakt so alt wie Renate. Ich erinnere mich, wie ich einmal Frau Hundstein vor ihrem Laden traf. Ich erzählte ihr, dass Renate heute Geburtstag hatte, genau wie Rudi. Das war zu Zeiten, als alles noch gut aussah. Die Deutschen fast am Ural in Nordafrika und die Amis noch nicht dabei. Frau Hundstein war ganz nett, aber ein bisschen einfach. Jetzt habe ich den Faden verloren. Ich nahm Joes Hand und drückte sie. Joe, du erinnerst dich, du mit Renate auf dem Rücken? Huckepack, rief Joe, stolz den Begriff gefunden zu haben. Genau, Huckepack hast du Renate genommen. Und die Frau Hundstein stand neben dir. Aber irgendwie seid ihr doch auf das Schiff gekommen. Was passierte jetzt? Joe kniff die Augen zusammen, um sich zu konzentrieren. Dann schüttelte sie den Kopf. Lena, ich weiß es nicht mehr. She's confusing Freya with Lena, which is her sister. Just to explain that for a moment. Yeah, she's sometimes the grandmother is confusing the names. Also, Joe kniff die Augen zusammen, um sich zu konzentrieren. Dann schüttelte sie den Kopf. Lena, ich weiß es nicht mehr. Johanna, du konntest deine Füße kaum noch spüren, so kalt war es. Genau, kaum noch spüren, so kalt war es, rief Joe und sah mich erwartungsvoll an, damit ich ihre Geschichte weitererzählen würde.
Joe, tell me again how it was. You were all at the pier and wanted to get on board the Theodor, but it was occupied because you'd arrived so late, with all your luggage. But somehow you managed to get to the front of the line and get on board the next day. My grandmother yawningly replied as if in response to the request for a cake recipe. At the beginning, they asked who had been in the party. Afterward, that was all too involved, and they just assumed that everyone had been in the party. We were already waiting. It was well below freezing. I think for a day and a half, I couldn't feel my feet anymore. At some point, a ship fellow, no clue what they're called, Mexican would know, and he said 8 more people, 8 and no more. Suddenly, 6 young women pushed their way to the front. Right, that's what happened. No idea where they came from so quickly. They were fast, but I had had it. We'd been there for a day and a half. And then these young things pushed up to the front, and they even still had on really elegant winter coats and didn't even look cold. I yelled, "We've waited longer than them. It's finally our turn." The ship fellow waved Lena and me forward. Yeah, that's exactly how it was. I can remember very well. It was terrible. I carried Renate piggyback because I wanted us to get through as one person. But then, suddenly, another lady was there beside us. I knew her, Frau Rundstein, with her son Rudolf, whom everybody called Rudi. What was it she did, Frau Rundstein? Hairdresser, that's what she was, now I remember. Her husband, somewhere on the Eastern Front. That Rudi had the brightest red hair and was exactly as old as Renate. I remember the time I met Frau Rundstein in front of her shop. I told her it was Renate's birthday, just like Rudi. That was back when everything still looked promising. The Germans almost to the Urals in North Africa and the Yanks not yet involved. Frau Rundstein was so nice, but a tad simple. Now I've lost my train of thought. I took Joe's hand and pressed it. "Joe, you'll remember. You had Renate on your back." "Piggyback," Joe cried, proud to have found the phrase. "Exactly, Renate, piggyback. And that Frau Rundstein was next to you. But somehow you got on board the ship. What happened next?" Joe squinted her eyes in order to concentrate. Then she shook her head. "Lena, I don't know anymore." "Johanna, you couldn't feel your feet any longer. That's how cold it was." "Exactly. Could scarcely feel them. That's how cold it was," cried Joe, and looked at me expectantly, so I would continue her story for her.
Maybe you noticed that Freya was calling her grandmother suddenly Johanna and not Joe. She's doing this on purpose because she noticed that her grandmother confused her in her dementia with Lena, her sister. Freya tries to sort of step into the past and play a bit like Lena and addressing her grandmother with the name her grandmother used at that time, Johanna. So she's doing that on purpose. Ich drückte noch einmal sanft ihre Hand. "Johanna, der Schiffsmann hatte die Wahl zwischen dir und Frau Rundstein. Er steht vor euch, er sieht von ihr zu dir und von dir zu ihr. Dann zwinkerst du ihm kokett zu und er winkt dich aufs Schiff." "Nein, Unsinn, du erzählst aber auch alles falsch", fuhr Joe mich an, und ich wusste, dass ich den richtigen Weg eingeschlagen hatte. Also die Frau Rundstein stand da plötzlich neben uns. Ja, und dann musste sich der Mann, vielleicht waren es auch mehrere, entscheiden, die oder wir. Und sie guckten zwischen Frau Rundstein und mir hin und her, und Frau Rundstein tat es mir plötzlich nach und hob ihren Rudi auf die Schultern. Ich war steif vor Angst. Ich dachte, noch eine Nacht hier draußen überlebe ich nicht. Joe blickte mich eindringlich an und schüttelte langsam den Kopf. Noch eine Nacht hier draußen überlebe ich nicht. Dann schwieg sie wieder. Ich überlegte krampfhaft, mit welchen Tricks ich diesmal ihr Gedächtnis überlisten könnte. Doch plötzlich fuhr sie völlig ungerührt fort. Da rief Natilein plötzlich. Vorher war sie den ganzen Tag still vor Angst gewesen. Also plötzlich rief die Kleine richtig laut, "Die haben gar nicht mehr den Gruß gemacht, schon ganz lange nicht mehr." Und Nati streckte ihren dünnen kleinen Arm sehr gerade nach vorn. Das weiß ich noch. Der Schiffsmann, der hatte übrigens einen hässlichen Bart, musterte Frau Rundstein. Weißt du, Kind, in dieser Zeit waren viele Leute nicht mehr sehr führertreu. Man war enttäuscht, fühlte sich verraten, aber so weit war man, wie soll ich sagen, doch noch nicht, dass man eine Verweigerung des Gehorsams geradewegs als Tugend empfunden hätte. Das war doch noch, wie soll ich sagen, anstößig. Jedenfalls, was wollte ich erzählen? Also dieser Schiffsmensch, Maxim könnte sagen, was das für einer war, der winkte mir und Renate dann zu. "Sie kenne ich doch auch", murmelte er noch zu mir. Und Frau Rundstein ließ ihren Rudi von den Schultern herab. Nie wieder haben wir sie gesehen. Blieben am Pier, gingen auf der Gustloff runter. Was weiß ich. Aber Renätchen hat uns das Leben gerettet. So war das. Joe nickte und beugte sich wieder über ihre Kompottschale. Im nächsten Moment hörte ich sie schmatzen. Ich starrte sie an. Joe schloss die Augen und faltete ihre Hände auf dem Schoß. Dann schloss auch ich die Augen und versuchte mir Renate, also ihre Mutter, vorzustellen, wie sie diesen unglaublichen Satz von sich gegeben hatte. Ich dachte an die Fotos von damals, aus der Zeit kurz vor der Flucht. Meine Mutter mit einer Mütze, deren Bänder unter ihrem Kinn verknotet waren, einem hellen Kleid, darunter wegen der Kälte Wollhosen und in zu großen Schnürstiefeln mit langen Schleifen, die fast auf den Boden reichten. Meine Mutter war sehr dünn und hatte ein spitzes, ängstliches Gesicht mit großen, etwas umschatteten Augen. und ihre Brauen waren auf jedem Bild in einer Art unendlicher, gedrückter Frage hochgezogen. Aber sind die Momente repräsentativ, die ein Foto einfängt? Man kann ihnen nicht trauen, diesen Schnappschüssen, die festhalten, behaupten und verallgemeinern, wenn doch fast alle unsere Gesten, Mienen und Momente in ein Meer aus nichts abgetaucht und vergessen sind.
I pressed her hand again gently. Johanna, the shipmate has to choose between you and Frau Hunstein. He's standing in front of all of you. He looks at you and then at her and back again. Then you bat your eyes at him and he waves you onto the ship. No, nonsense, you're telling it all wrong, Joe berated me, and I knew I was on the right track. So that Frau Hunstein suddenly shows up next to us. Yeah, and then the man had to, maybe there were more, decide her or us, and they looked back and forth from me to Frau Hunstein, and Frau Hunstein suddenly starts copying me and put her Rudi onto her shoulders. I was frozen with fear. I thought to myself, I am not going to survive another night out here. Joe looked at me intently and slowly shook her head. I am not going to survive another night. Then she fell silent again. My mind raced as I considered what tricks I could outfox her memory with this time. But suddenly she continued quite unmoved. Then little Nati cried out suddenly. Up to that point she'd been quiet the whole day out of fear. So suddenly, the little one cried out loud and clear, they haven't done the salute for a long time whenever they see us, not for a long time. And Nati stretched out her skinny little arm right out in front of her. I can still see it. Shipmate, he had an awfully ugly beard, by the way, looked Frau Hunstein up and down. You know, child, back then many people were not any longer very Führer loyal. People were disappointed, felt betrayed. That's how far we'd gotten, how should I put it, but not yet ready to refuse obedience outright. Felt like it was a virtue, but still was, how should I put it, incorrect at least. What was I saying? So the shipmate, Mexican, could tell you what his rank was. He waved Renata and me on board. I know her too, he murmured to me then, and Frau Hunstein took her Rudi off her shoulders. We never saw her again. Stayed back on the pier, went down with a Gustav or whatever. But dear little Renata has saved our lives. That's how it was. Joe nodded and bent over her stewed fruit once more. A second later, I could hear the noise of her eating. I stared at her. Jo closed her eyes and folded her hands in her lap. Then I closed my eyes too and tried to imagine Renata uttering that unfathomable sentence. I thought about the photos from back then, from the time just before they'd fled, my mother in a cap with its strings knotted beneath her chin, in a light-colored dress and wearing woolen pants under it because of the cold, and in oversized laced-up boots with long shoestrings that reached almost to the floor. My mother was very thin and had a pointed, anxious face with large, somewhat shadowed eyes. But are the moments captured by a photo representative ones? They are not to be trusted, these snapshots that freeze a moment, that posit something, and overgeneralize, even though all our gestures, facial expressions, and moments have since gone down in a sea of nothingness and have been forgotten.
Jetzt schob Jo ihre warme, schlaffe Hand in meine. Ich spürte ihren langsamen Puls und öffnete die Augen. Renate hört das alles nicht mehr gern, dass sie uns das Leben gerettet hat. Sie hört das nicht gern, kennt sie ja. Ich sah auf das eingefallene Gesicht meiner Großmutter und bemerkte, wie ihr Blick nach rechts zur Tür wanderte. Ihre Stirn zog sich unheilverkündend in Falten. In der Tür stand Renate. Sie stand dort, die Arme in die Hüften gestemmt und sah uns finster an. Ich hatte keine Vorstellung, wie lange sie dort schon gestanden hatte. Ich blickte zwischen meiner Mutter, die dort groß und aufrecht in der Tür stand, und meiner kleinen, zusammengesunkenen Großmutter hin und her. Ich spürte Joes Anspannung an der Versteifung ihrer Hand in meiner. Sie war immer noch regungslos, nur ihre Augen waren starr nach rechts gerichtet. Ich sah auf den Staub am Saum des dunklen Brokatvorhangs, den Joe schon sehr lange nicht mehr aufzog. Ich blickte auf die Strohsterne, die Renate als Kind gebastelt hatte, die seit Jahrzehnten ebenfalls eingestaubt an dem Knauf einer Sekretärschublade hingen. Ich schaute auf das Foto meines Großvaters, ohne Prothese, hoch zu Ross, mit einem gewinnenden, naiven Lächeln, das ich nur von Schwarz-Weiß-Fotos an ihm kannte. Plötzlich wurde mir übel. Eine Schwelle, ein Schwall aus meinem Bauch drückte nach oben und ich sprang auf, stürzte zum Bad und übergab mich. Ich hörte nichts, kein einziges Geräusch aus der ganzen stummen Wohnung, bis auf mein eigenes Würgen. Schließlich spülte ich mir den Mund aus, wischte mir mit einem Stück Klopapier den Schweiß von der Stirn, legte eine Hand schützend auf meinen Bauch und ging, immer noch leicht zitternd in die Küche, wo ich mich auf einen Stuhl fallen ließ.
Now Jo thrust her warm, limp hand into mine. I felt her slow pulse and opened my eyes. Renata doesn't like hearing about all of that anymore, that she saved our lives. She doesn't like to hear it. You know what she's like. I looked at the gaunt face of my grandmother and noticed that her eyes wandered to the right, to the door. Her forehead set itself into ominous folds. In the door stood Renata. She stood there with her hands on her hips and glowered at us. I had no idea how long she'd been standing there. I looked back and forth between my mother, standing large and upright in the door, and my tiny, haggard grandmother. I felt Jo's tension by the stiffness of her hand in mine. She was motionless still, her eyes alone were fixed toward the right. I observed the dust and the hem of the dark brocade curtain that Jo hadn't pulled open for a very long time. I observed the stars made out of straw that Renata had crafted as a child, which were decades old, equally dusty, and hanging from the drawer pull of a roll-top desk. Jesus mounted on a horse, with a winning, naive smile I only knew from black and white photos of it. Suddenly I felt sick. A wave, a gush from within my stomach surged upward, and I jumped up, dashed to the bathroom, and vomited. I didn't hear a thing, not a single sound from the whole mute apartment, nothing but my own retching. Finally, I rinsed out my mouth, wiped the sweat from my forehead with a piece of toilet paper, laid a hand protectively on my stomach, and went, still trembling slightly, to the kitchen, where I let myself fall into a chair.
Dann hörte ich meine Mutter sagen, das solltest du nicht erzählen. Was meinst du? Fragte Jo harmlos. Die Geschichte von damals. Welche denn? Was hab ich denn erzählt? Wie wir auf dem Schiff das Marmeladenglas versteckt hatten? Ich traute meiner Großmutter zu, dass sie sich nicht mehr erinnerte, worüber sie eben noch gesprochen hatte. Warum habe ich das wohl gesagt? Wer hat denn zu Hause Strichlisten über die Nachbarn geführt und mich dazu angehalten, meine Spielkameraden... Ich erinnere mich nicht, schrie Jo auf einmal. Dann fuhr sie plötzlich ganz ruhig fort. Freya versteht das. Wir waren Kinder unserer Zeit. Freya hat uns nie Vorwürfe gemacht. Freya ist nicht so wie du, was weiß ich. Bring mir Tee mit Honig, mit Waldhonig. Ich bin das alles leid. Ich bin dich leid. Ich bin mich leid. Bring mir Tee mit Waldhonig. Später trat ich zu meiner Mutter, die in Jos Küche vor dem Fenster stand. Einen Moment lang schwiegen wir und ich überlegte, was ich so schnell wie möglich sagen könnte, um ihr nicht das Gefühl zu geben, aus Entsetzen über sie zu schweigen. Aber bevor ich einen Satz formulieren konnte, begann Renate schon. Als die Gustloff unterging, genau in dem Moment, wo sie endgültig versank, ist plötzlich überall auf dem Schiff die gesamte Beleuchtung angesprungen, eingeschaltet wie von einem Geist, eine richtige Festbeleuchtung für den Untergang. Das haben alle Überlebenden immer wieder geschildert.
Then I heard my mother say, "You should not tell that story." "What do you mean?" asked Joe guilelessly. "That story from back then." "Which one? What did I tell? That we hid the jelly jar on the ship?" I believe my grandmother is no longer recalling what she had just been talking about. "Why do you suppose I said that? Who kept a tally at home of all the neighbors and even tried to get me to do that with my playmates?" "I don't remember," Joe screamed suddenly. Then she continued quite calmly again. "Freya understands. We were children of our time. Freya never reproached us. Freya isn't like you, so, I don't know. Bring me some tea with honey, with forest honey. I'm tired of all of this. I'm tired of you. I'm tired of me. Bring me some tea with forest honey." Later, I walked over to my mother, who was standing at the window in Joe's kitchen. For a moment, we were silent, and I considered what I could say fast enough to keep from giving her the feeling that I was silent because I was horrified about her. But before I could formulate a sentence, Renata had already begun. When the Gustloff went down, in the very moment she finally sank, suddenly all the lights on the ship went on, as if turned on by a ghost, a real illumination for the sinking. All the survivors recounted the same thing over and over.
Renate, weißt du so viel über dieses Schiff, weil du später Rudi unter den Überlebenden gesucht hast? Ja. Und was ist das jetzt mit der Festbeleuchtung? Die Festbeleuchtung ist die Festbeleuchtung. Ich komme nicht darüber hinweg. Ich muss immer an die Festbeleuchtung denken. Als das Schiff unterging, ging überall das Licht an. Mutti, das hatte ich noch nie gesagt. Wollen wir einen kleinen Spaziergang machen? Ich glaube, das würde dir jetzt gut tun. Freya, Die Sirene ging plötzlich los, als das Schiff unterging. Und habe ich dir erzählt, dass der schwere Kreuzer Hipper, das erste Schiff am Unfallort, keinen einzigen Schiffbrüchigen mitnehmen konnte? Habe ich dir das erzählt? Nein. Nimm mal deine Jacke und wir lassen Joe kurz allein. Freya, es gab zu wenig Rettungsboote und die Rettungsboote in den Davids wurden nicht ausgeschwenkt. Man hat noch die Blaukammern geöffnet und einige Passagiere konnten ein paar dieser vor Kälte schützenden blauen Anzüge anziehen. Aber Freya, die Außentemperatur betrug -20 Grad und als das Schiff unterging, leuchtete es noch einmal auf. Freya, es leuchtete und ging unter. Ich weiß nicht, wie viele Lampen, Glühbirnen, Betten, Tische, Toiletten, Waschbecken die Gustloff hatte. Freya, es gibt so vieles, was ich nicht weiß. Bitte komm. Freya, ich spreche nicht gern. Bitte komm. Nein, ich bleibe hier. Ich möchte hier stehen bleiben und hinaussehen. Der Sonnenuntergang, wie er alles mit sich reißt. Dieses mörderische Rot, dieses verlogene Orange, das gierige Gelb. Jeden Tag wird die Welt zertrümmert. Immer wieder wird etwas aufgebaut, etwas geboren, aus der Taufe gehoben, an den Zenit geschleudert und immer wieder rinnt und tropft alles herab, glänzt auf, um stumpf und unsichtbar zu werden. Immer wieder am Ende die Nacht. Meine Mutter stand am Fenster, lächelte mich jetzt wie aus weiter Ferne an, machte eine ausgreifende Geste in Richtung Sonne, als würden wir gerade einen kleinen Spaziergang zu ihr hin unternehmen. Als wären die Maßstäbe, die Dimensionen, die Zeit und die Welt vollkommen anders.
Renate, do you know so much about this ship because you looked for Rudi among the survivors afterward? Yeah. And what is the thing now with the illumination? Lighting is lighting. I can't get over it. I can't get that illumination out of my head. When the ship went down, suddenly all the lights went on. Mommy, I never said that before. Why don't we take a little walk? I think it would do you good now. Freya, the siren went off suddenly when the ship went down. And I told you that the heavy cruiser Hippa, the first ship to the scene of the accident, could not take a single shipwrecked person. Did I tell you that? No. Here, take your jacket, and we'll leave Joe to her own devices for a bit. Freya, there were too many lifeboats, and the lifeboats in the davits weren't lowered. They did open the wetsuit rooms, and some passengers managed to put on a few of those blue suits that protect against the cold. But Freya, the outside temperature was below freezing, and when the ship went down, it was still lit up. Freya, it lighted up and went under. I don't know how many lamps, light bulbs, beds, tables, toilets, wash basins the Gustloff had. Freya, there's so much I don't know. Please, let's go. Freya, I don't like talking. Please, come on. No, I'm staying here. I want to stay here and look out the window. The sunset, the way it absorbs everything. This murderous red, this deceptive orange, the greedy yellow. Every day the world is destroyed. Every day something gets built back up again. Something's born, lifted out in a baptismal font, catapulted to its climax, and over everything runs out and trickles out, flickers only to become dulled and invisible. Over and over at the end of the night. My mother stood at the window, smiled at me now as if from a great distance, made a sweeping gesture toward the sun as if to say we were undertaking a little walk toward it, as if units of measure, dimensions, time, and the world itself were all entirely different.
Well, now to sum up what's happening at the end of this chapter, Freya is afraid after this conversation, after this revelation, to lose her child, and she's feeling very guilty that she's now like giving birth to a child and will continue the family tree, the family chain, whereas another family died and like couldn't have ancestors. Though she knows, of course, that her baby is not guilty of this, but she's very much thinking about herself suddenly being in this chain of the family and also somehow being locked in this. You know, I mean, you continue something, but what are you continuing? Which family history? And she feels that she's also trapped in that and a part of this, whether she wants or not. And yes, she's thinking about this while walking through the city of Berlin, which is still visibly marked by the Second World War, and she's asking herself whether she or her child will experience other wars, which wars might come up, and which role she's going to take in these wars, whether she will be, for example, a worried mother, her son will be in the war, or what her role will be. So that's the end of this chapter and the end of our reading. And I would like to thank Marilya very much for translating all this. I think that